I'm Nina Turner, and you're watching Free Speech TV.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. And in the studio with us is Charles Sauer, Libertarian, Economist, President of the Market Institute, marketinstitute.org. You can tweet him at Charles Sauer, S-A-U-E-R. And Charles, welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
It's always nice having you here in the studio with us. So let's talk about some issues here. I have two, and I'll just share these stories as setup. Okay. The first is from the New York Times today. Steve Erlanger, the headline, "After Grenfell Tower Fire, United Kingdom asks, has deregulation gone too far?" Turns out that they have now found 120 high-rises that are clad. The outside is covered with this aluminum siding that has polyethylene in the middle of it, which is highly flammable, which is why all these people died in this tower, which, by the way, you can't sell for towers in the United States. It's only authorized for buildings 12 feet tall or shorter. But in the UK, well, here, I'll read you from the story. This started with Maggie Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher introduced the right to buy social housing to its tenants in 1980. Over time, the nature of social housing changed. Some apartments became simply private rental properties, including an unknown number in Grenfell Tower itself. Under conservative efforts since 2010 to reduce the national budget and the national debt, state funding was reduced or frozen for many parts of the government, including local councils, which we would call, city councils or whatever. Deregulation also meant outsourcing responsibility for fire inspections to the owners of the buildings instead of the civil servants. So the owners of the buildings are saying, oh, yeah, well, so it's flammable. It's cheaper, it's cheaper. And, and a bunch of people are dead. Meanwhile, here in the United States, Scott Pruitt and his Environmental Protection Agency are, this from Oliver Millman in today's Guardian, the EPA is poised to dismantle the federal Clean Water Rule, which protects waterways that provide drinking water to about a third of the U.S. population. Scott Pruitt said, "We are taking significant action to return power to the states and provide regulatory certainty to our nation's farmers and businesses."
That's a great man.
Yeah, well, they had regulatory certainty before. They knew what the law was. But in any case, green groups have said that the move pandered to fossil fuel and farming interests, was part of an agenda to weaken clean water protections, led by farmers and golf course operators. And the National Mining Association welcomed its impending demise. So in recent months, the EPA has wound back rules curbing vehicle emissions, toxic waste from power plants, and methane leaks from oil and gas drilling operations. So basically, here in the United States, they're making our environment more poisonous in order to increase the profits of industry. And in the UK, they're making their buildings more deadly in order to increase the profit of landlords. And all of this in the name of deregulation. What's a libertarian to say?
Well, let's start with the London thing first. First off, that the building fire was a tragedy. There's no political side to the fact of whether that was a tragedy or not. Politically or government-wise, there is a major issue. There's a problem when you have this public-private relationship going on. There is this, the incentives are incorrect. The incentives when the government is giving funding to a private person to supply these services, then their incentive is to provide the cheapest services as possible.
How is that any different from if they're buying them in the so-called free market?
Because if you're in the free market and your building just went up in fire, you're not going to make money from that tomorrow.
Well, I don't think that, there's a lot of people in the government housing who are moving out right now too.
Well, but now who does the public hold accountable? Do they vote out these politicians that weren't the ones to put those policies in place? The market can't correct the way when a government's involved, the way that it is when the private sector is the one controlling. So in London, what you have, again, both sides were wrong here, but the incentives were set up because of this weird public-private mix. We see it in healthcare in the United States.
Because of greed. The fact that the money for building these buildings came from the UK government, and some of the ongoing maintenance costs. I don't see how that's any different than it came from, you know, private investors. I mean, they're still going to say, do it as cheaply as you can. We want a big dividend on our investment.
No, I mean, that's a business is looking at returns tomorrow and returns in the future. The government
not businesses in this day and age. They're looking at the next quarter.
That is a CEO who is going to be out of a job in a few quarters, right?
With his $30 million parachute. That's all he wants.
Well, that's not the incentive for the board of directors. That's not the incentive for the companies in the long run. If we switch over to water, we can actually look at where private water is delivered in the U.S. They have a better track record than public water systems, and it's just because of this incentive for a private system to look out towards investing in infrastructure. Detroit's a good example of this.
Better track record at what?
They have less infractions per million people served from the EPA.
Private water systems. Yeah, but you know, we have no idea why that is. I mean, many of the water systems that have been privatized were water systems that were like in really, really great shape, and the companies wanted to come in and buy them up. We got French water companies. FINA, I think, is the name of the big one.
Yep.
You've got Australian water companies. I mean, a lot of the water operations in the United States are not owned by Americans even. They're owned by foreign companies. And they're not interested in buying a water system in crisis like Flint, Michigan. They're only going to buy the water systems that are just like running smooth as silk. And so if you then look at those systems, you'd say, oh, those systems are fine. Well, they're fine because public money made them fine to begin with.
And I will
building.
I disagree with a part of that, but because after it's privatized, the incentive for the private company is to maintain that system, because now they have a source
to profit it.
Not only is their incentive the long-term profits, their incentive is to also not supply the wealthy people that live outside of the city, but it's to supply the people where most of their money's coming from, which is where you can have a dense, massive population.
This is the biggest problem with privatized water systems, and it was. I mean, this is why you had the REA, the Rural Electrification Administration, the RTA, the Rural Telephony Administration, under Roosevelt and Eisenhower, respectively, because for-profit telephone companies, for-profit electric companies had no interest in running unprofitable lines out into the country. And the same with water, but
that's a lot of what left those farmers and ranchers out there in those lands, even though the lands were never going to be profitable. I mentioned this last week when we switched roles, but what I didn't mention was that the subsidies that went to help the people in the hill country helps keep them in poverty for the years to come, because their property was never meant to be developed. It doesn't get enough rain per year.
By whom?
Nature and nature. I mean,
well, couldn't you say that about the city of Phoenix or Vegas?
If people moved there and they were getting
nature never intended for a city to be in Phoenix. It's desert or Las Vegas. I mean,
yeah,
you know, but people did it. We did it.
I don't know the history of the rural electric going in Vegas, but the rural electric going into rural Texas kept people where they didn't get enough rainfall per year to grow crops, and yet where the federal government was spending money to keep these poor people in poverty.
They're going to stay in their homes just because now they have electricity?
They were, and they did, and that helped keep them out there even longer than they should have. Helped soil erosion, helped a lot of things.
That seems like a pretty weak argument, and none of this addresses the issue that I originally set here, which is regulation. Government regulation in the United States says you may not build a skyscraper that is covered with flammable material. Maggie Thatcher said regulation is a terrible thing. They deregulated it in the UK, and people died. Here in the United States with regard to water, the EPA was protecting 1/3 of all our waters through the Clean Water Rule, and now they're going to dial that back so that coal miners and coke industries and other big polluters can dump more crap in the water.
That statement's completely incorrect, right? So President Obama implemented in 2015 WOTUS, the Waters of the United States Act, which, you know, a lot of the right pans as regulating puddles, although actually I would say in the rule it says that it does not involve puddles. They actually, but they don't define puddles. So a lot of the right is still about that. But the courts put a stay. The sixth district court stayed that rule back in 2015. So it was put in 2015 stayed in 2015. All that Trump is doing is saying, hey, let's clarify this and say we'll roll back to the 2015 language. They're putting that back in until we can figure out in the courts what it meant.
My understanding of this is that the Waters of the U.S. rule wasn't some brand new regulation. There were some pieces to it, but it consolidated a lot of existing regulations. And that what these big polluters want is to blow away those regulations that in many cases had been here since the 70s. And that were essentially reincorporated into the Waters of the U.S. rule. In fact, if you read the legislation, about 3/4 of it is reference to other laws. It's that arcane legal language. So it wasn't some new thing that they came up with.
Well, let me make the arcane legal language pretty simple.
Well, no, very simply, why should we not have government regulations protecting our water and from being poisoned and our buildings from being flammable?
Well, again, everything that was in law pre-2015 will still be in law.
No, you're not answering my question. Why should we not have government regulations?
The question doesn't make any sense because you said the hardest that WOTUS did, all that this Waters of the United States rule did was codify a bunch of things from 2015.
No, well, and it added new things as well.
And in that case, the Scott Pruitt administration's not doing anything. All that they're rolling back is the legal uncertainty of what was put in the 2015
I'm trying to take us out of the weeds here and take us to 30,000 feet. Why are you opposed to government regulation that protects our water and protects our buildings? I don't get it. Why would you be opposed to that? That's a question that wasn't involved in the setup here because the private market enforces its own version of regulations, and that's by having the profit motive. In 2008.
That's by having the profit motive out ahead. Again, that's a place where the government mandated who they had to give loans to, the numbers they had to give the roles to. It's where this interaction.
There was no mandate. You're going to try and pull out that Jimmy Carter, it's all his fault thing, because he ended redlining?
Yep. That's
he didn't say you have to loan to people in black neighborhoods. He said you can no longer refuse to loan to people simply because they live in a black neighborhood. But if they got lousy credit, you can turn them down.
I can't think of it off the top of my head right now, but I believe that there was some Clinton-era stuff on that as well. I believe that George W. Bush is not out of this one. There's incentives to increase the loans in subprime loans, and the banks took advantage of those and ran it into a place that shouldn't be there.
Okay.
It's the intersection.
Charles, you have the last word. Charles Sauer, at Charles Sauer, marketinstitute.org. Thank you, Charles.
Thank you.
We'll be back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls right after this.